Sometimes you get an idea that you know deep down will make few but you happy. This is that idea. So if you ask 1,000 people what makes for a good writer, you probably won't get 1,000 different answers, so much as 1,000 different exceptions to whatever rules they put forward. It's one of those awkward points that tends to come up whenever folks start talking about objective criticism, especially in the arts, where by some measure there is a competence required to actually deliver a work to the masses. If you've got some criteria by which you say someone is a good writer, inevitably there is going to be at least one exception to the rule where you're going to have to groan and say, okay, yeah, fine, they broke or ignored some of the rules, and then you include them in the conversation anyway because it was just that good. This gets all the more complicated when you recognize that the commercial promotion of art doesn't have to correspond with any degree of quality. It can set a baseline, as in delivering a finished product, but savvy marketing can make something popular without it being, all that good. You all know that, right? And it gets even more complicated when you consider a songwriter, where you're not just focusing on the text on the page, but how to translate that text into music. And for every argument that you can make around what makes for a good writer, multiply it even further by what makes a good musician, a songwriter, and then you've got that discourse. And when you start factoring in history and genre and stylism within the genre and subgenres, to say nothing of the audience or singular critic's experience with said art and their own distinctive biases, almost at a convenience to stop a bad argument and an encroaching migraine, we just embrace subjectivity. Not just in the art that we consider good, but also in the songwriting precepts that would describe it as being good art. We all have our exceptions, and quite frankly, we're all better for it. But that's not exactly useful nor fun now, is it? So instead, let's narrow our scope and throw some propane on the campfire for good measure. Let's focus on folk rock, generally described by many as the most writerly of the genres. Yes, we'll probably have to come back to that cultural assumption later. Sit down and pick two artists who are receiving some measure of attention and acclaim in 2026. On the one hand, you got a singer-songwriter that you've all probably heard of before, at least on the radio, with hit records. From Stratford, Vermont, age 29, with 4 albums under his belt, and his most recent dropping last Friday as of time of recording, with multiple reviews suggesting that it is his best album to date, albeit with still mixed reviews as a whole. The other singer-songwriter you might not recognize if you only listen to the mainstream, be it radio or streaming. He's from Silver Spring, Maryland. He's turning 60 this year, and while he has never had a Hot 100 hit, in specific circles he will be more acclaimed for multiple classic albums than our first writer probably ever will, including his most recent project, which many are calling a late career highlight. I would happen to agree. We're going to be using those recent albums as our case studies. They both dropped this year. They both have received some measure of attention or acclaim among those who are in the know. They're probably both going to make some critics' year-end list. In some cases, if the list is big enough, both albums will be on the same list. And yet, when I proposed this comparison to some friends and colleagues who knew one or the other or both artists, they thought I was flat out insane. There surely wasn't enough here to properly compare them. It wouldn't be fair, nor all that realistic. They might as well be in different area codes or universes. Yet we're gonna do it anyway, and maybe find out something special or intriguing along the way. Maybe something that fans of one and not the other might learn about the acts, or the albums, or themselves. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and this is not so much 2 reviews as a songwriter face-off between Noah Kahan and The Great Divide and Bill Callahan and My Days at 58.
I'm remembering, I promised to forget you now, but it's raining and I'm calling drunk. And my medicine is drowning your perspective out, so I ain't taking any fall.
So to make this anything close to serious or have some intellectual vigor here, we gotta set the terms of this comparison somewhat fairly. Those of you who might have seen my reviews might think I have a predisposed bias one way or the other, depends on what you see, and I want to expunge some of this before we get into the weeds with it. I'm gonna draw a lot of parallels in between their work, and I do want to be as fair as possible. I can be a pretty harsh critic, and I do have my biases, some of which y'all might know. Like, all of us do have biases, but I want to make this a sincere intellectual exercise comparing between these two male rock-adjacent folk singer-songwriters from the United States. And for the sake of this experiment, we are going to be sharply narrowing our focus to their most recent albums, the ones that dropped this year. The history will absolutely be relevant in discussing how their art manifests, where it came from, but neither man is going to get to rest on their laurels, and I think we're all the better for it. And where my work feels most cut out for me, it's Noah Kahan, because if you're a fan of his, you might have seen my short, generally dismissive review of Styx Season back in 2022 and assumed that I am setting him up to fail, or you're already a mainstream fan of Noah Kahan and you're just seeing me for the first time and you're wondering why I'm comparing him to some no-name that you've never heard of before. Now, this is the first real problem you encounter when talking about two acts that are in completely different ecosystems of fame. And let's not act that that's not relevant to how their art is shaped or perceived. Like it or not, Noah Kahan has some major label obligation to make hit songs, and he's proven to be pretty good at it. He's not a one-hit wonder. He's got multiple charting songs. He's likely going to get a pretty big album bomb on the Hot 100 in about a week or so, and to his credit, it's not as if his art has gotten measurably worse by playing into the game. Some of those songs are legitimately great. I've highlighted them on year-end lists of the best hit songs of their respective years. In one case, one of the best songs of that year, irregardless of being a hit. I stand by it. As such, you can't fully remove the context of that popularity because it doesn't just shape how the audience engages with him, be it on record or stage, but as Noah Kahan has proven, it's actually shaped some of the actual text of his music. There are multiple moments on The Great Divide that are explicitly referencing his newfound celebrity status, for better or for worse. And to his credit, it helps strengthen the emotional impact and the realism of his themes. We'll get into a lot of that later. But at the same time, that popularity can and will be turned against him by those who just don't claim to care. They think he's making accessible, dumbed-down pap for the masses. That celebrity does not fit well on him anyway. The newest manifestation of stomp, clap, holler, and not even unique enough in that lane to be worthy of an exception. I see both sides of this argument. It can feel true, mostly on the surface, coming through a differentiation between the expectations of the public versus those of, well, most critics, which on some level are different by nature of experience and expertise. Not only have critics heard way more music and are considerably less impressed by nailing the formula, we're often listening for different things, more unique touches, we're more forgiving of novelty, we're trying to pick out different elements that resonate with us and then explain why they do nor don't. We're not simply here for well-trod entertainment, even if we inevitably acknowledge that factor. We want to be here for the art and discuss music on that term. So then you've got Bill Callahan. Necessarily, he's going to need a little bit more of an introduction as a singer-songwriter. Predominantly active in the 90s under the moniker Smog, as he gradually evolved his sound from lo-fi, noisy, instrumental cassette recordings to the more refined folk singer-songwriter approach that would deliver multiple classic albums in the 2000s and 2010s. In the latter case, when he started using his own name a lot more directly, and when I happened to get on board with his music. For the record, his albums Apocalypse and Dream River in the early 2010s, they're among the best of that decade. Full stop. I have that bias in acknowledging it. I'm also fairly certain that if I showed the average Noah Kahan fan a Bill Callahan record, and when I say average, I'm speaking to the wider silent majority mainstream audience, not a lot of people in this comment section, cool your jets. At best, they might say they don't really get it, or it's not for them. At worst, they would think it sucks. Full stop. I mean, he's got a pleasant voice, but he's so soft-spoken, it's tedious. The songs tend to meander without much in the way of structured melodic hooks, even if you get a hook at all. And that's to say nothing of the writing style, which feels a lot more disconnected free verse than telling more of a direct story, getting to its point. A style of more difficult poetry, which famously tends to get a polarized reaction from a lot of people, if they even consider it all that poetic at all. It is not music that rewards instant gratification. And while I would agree with fans and say, yeah, duh, that's the point, by necessity, it's a harder sell for those who simply want to be entertained. It's not easy entertainment. It's why he's been independent on Drag City for the majority of his career, and he's got far less name recognition as a result. And even in years where he will make incredible albums, it's not surprising if he might slip into the background. Never quite topped that year-end list for a lot of critics. Of course, for a lot of critics, or even rock audiences that came up closer to the 90s, Bill Callahan might be even more approachable than the polished pop folk of Noah Kahan. In the historical movements of noise rock and experimental singer-songwriters of the late 80s and early 90s that embraced a lot of noisy, obtuse abstraction, deconstruction, irony, Bill Callahan fits really well into that world. He had multiple albums produced by Jim O'Rourke of Sonic Youth, for God's sake. And yeah, Sonic Youth never had American hits outside of the alternative charts, but as I said in my video essay on Ella Langley a couple weeks ago, the Hot 100 wasn't always representative of certain formats when singles weren't being promoted beyond left of the dial. I bring all this up because there was genuinely a brief yet formative moment in popular culture where Bill Callahan's archetype might have been actually closer to the fickle arts of popularity and certainly critical acclaim than the charts might recognize, and yet both are indeed fickle, as this isn't much of a lane that exists anymore for those whose parents aren't hyperlinks on the Wikipedia page. Going back to Noah Kahan, he is lucky that enough of the stomp, clap, holler sound never quite left the adult contemporary zeitgeist, or that it slipped into a nostalgia window. As refined of a songwriter as he is, with plenty of easy hooks, let's be real, Noah Kahan got exceptionally lucky to be in the right place at the right time. He knows it. He has said it in his writing. So this produces something of an interesting contrast. Noah Kahan played the commercial game, and I would say he's won. On the surface, in his style of writing and presentation, he's not exactly deconstructing much of any system, whereas Bill Callahan's sound in the execution, it's all about that deconstruction of what would be commercially viable as more mainstream entertainment. But for a brief snapshot of time in the late 80s and early 90s on alternative radio, which never seemed to quite last as long as we all wanted, and yet Bill Callahan's career has lasted for decades. It's got a sustained longevity that any working musician now would envy. Might be on smaller stages, might seem more precarious in the modern music industry, but he has paradoxically a lot more freedom, more grace from his audience and his label to do more of whatever he wants. Even again, from his label Drag City, where in an interview with The Guardian recently, Callahan admitted he's got complete control. He can just make his album, give it to them, and they're fine. If Noah Kahan wants to experiment, push his sound, which he does do on The Great Divide with interesting results, we'll get into it, he's got to go through Mercury Republic. There's at least 2 PowerPoint decks involved to actually push that. He has reached a higher commercial height, but that means he's got further to fall, more to lose. And boy, I think he knows that too. In fact, there's a real possibility that if both men knew about each other, they might see something in the other to admire. Well, somewhat. Noah Kahan is very open about how much he wants to work with folks that he likes, many of which I would describe as better musicians and writers. Hell, he might even say it too. So he'd probably see someone like Bill Callahan as an eccentric legend. He'd be very curious. Whereas Callahan would see himself less as a craftsman, more of a self-prescribed drunk professor. To quote him again from that Guardian article, a craftsman builds something out of nothing. and I think I receive things that are already built and make sure the reception is accurate. I think if he sees something he might admire in Noah Kahan, which is possible, if he even thinks about him at all, it might come with the respect of game recognizing game. One music professional acknowledging another, especially given the stages Kahan has had to play, appreciating the ability to capture lightning in a bottle. The kids in the end will be fine, playing on the island in my mind, and when the island's gone, they'll be finer. And this is where I think the conversation could very easily stop, and indeed for some, it already has. The two male American folk musicians on form and function, they are just not comparable. They're playing very different games. They want to do very different things. It does not make sense. One is fundamentally a formalist, that is Noah Kahan, where you can trace the lineage of his blend of pop, folk, rock, and country throughout the annals of music history, and a music industry that is eager to canonize that progression, while Bill Callahan is abstract, deconstructionist, looking at ways to prod and poke at that formalism in interesting ways. Of course, with enough time, that sort of deconstruction builds its own traditions, can be just as formalized and respectable and receive its own age and acclaim, of which I think Bill Callahan knows. And that's an interesting wrinkle to explore, how the execution of specific art movements that shifts with age and time, that you can credibly say both men have their established formula, and that's why we have to go deeper. The immediate problem you encounter with measuring songwriting is that, well, there's no rubric for it. You often see frameworks around what comprises good things to have in songwriting or songs, but just as quickly you will find valid exceptions. And anyone who claims that there's some sort of objective measurement is talking out of their ass. Or should I just dredge up that old clip from Dead Poets Society again? It feels very relevant.
To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. One, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question one rates the poem's perfection. Question two rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great.
Excrement. That's what I think of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. We're not laying pipe, we're talking about poetry. How can you describe poetry like American Bandstand? Well, I like Byron, I give him a 42, but I can't dance to it.
Now, for example, I generally agree with the idea that you want your songs to feel unique to you as an artist, showcase an authorial voice or perspective that doesn't feel generic. But I don't know, calling something generic necessarily places your work in contrast with established tropes, historical trends, of which they had to spring from somewhere, and they weren't exactly considered generic at the time. And they may even still have some unique resonance with broad or basic subject matter in both past and future. History often becomes acutely relevant, especially in folk music. I don't tend to use generic as a critique for that very reason, but it is an easy critique to throw at mainstream accessible folk acts, especially those like Noah Kahan, that they have sanded off the distinctive qualities that would make them a more unique songwriter in order to placate that mainstream audience and to fit on that streaming playlist. But while that might have been more true about his sound and production before, The Great Divide is looking to challenge that assertion. And even when I don't like his writing, I would never claim Noah Kahan doesn't have a voice as a songwriter. It's just that it can feel kind of overworked, filled with questionable details, minutia, and neuroticisms, and occasionally sentiments that annoy me to death. Don't worry, he's far from the only one there. Now, Bill Callahan does not have to deal with any sort of argument around his uniqueness. Although go digging on Bandcamp long enough, and you'll find plenty of semi-abstracted older singer-songwriters that treat structure with limited interest. But okay, Bill Callahan does have a unique texture to both his vocals and his writing that sets him in a lane mostly of his own. But another qualifier that's been linked to good songwriting, it's memorability. Something that might draw you back time and time again when you are not listening to music, that gets stuck in your brain. In most cases, it's a melodic hook. It's a great turn of phrase. And this is where Noah Kahan might shine in a way Bill Callahan might not. And there are two ways to broach this conversation. The first being the statement that hooks, they don't matter, that you can be memorable in other ways, like texture or vibes or a starkly compelling idea. I don't know, I think that's half true. It's certainly more important in more abstract art that you can cultivate some of those memorable factors. See my great love of ambient music if you want to explore that. But even if you're intentionally not playing that calculated, more accessible game, I've also heard entirely too much music to seem to think that it's above writing melodic hooks when you are simply just to be awed by all the technical competency and expertise on display. Progressive rock and metal have now entered the chat, and they can leave it as soon as possible. Now, the better argument, in my opinion, is that Bill Callahan does not write hooks with that same immediacy, but they are often still there. They're softer, they're understated, they might not grab you on first listen, but they form the deceptive earworms of a lot of cycling patterns, the little melodies you might not think you remembered until they haven't left your head for months. This is where critics might be willing to give Bill Callahan's music a little bit more space to properly sink in, which is that mingled blessing and curse of more abstract art. It demands a certain amount of patience, but it might just reward it. And those looking for instant gratification might not get what they want, but they could with time. Noah Kahan might stick faster and will work for more people, but might fall off just as quickly if you place yourself at that audience's mercy. But this is where you encounter a new problem. A lot of arguments I have seen online about what makes good songwriting comes from the framework and perspective of how to be a successful songwriter. And by that meaning looking to have a career that is focused more on, well, entertainment, not the art of it all, because sometimes they do not work at the same purpose. For a very happy and coincidental example, the New York Times reached out to 6 professional music critics and over 200 music insiders to produce a list of the best living American songwriters. Unsurprisingly, neither Noah Kahan nor Bill Callahan made that list, albeit for likely very different reasons. But dig between the weeds and who is included versus excluded, and you see a distinct preference towards older acts with a distinct amount of mass appeal. What you would expect coming out of the goddamn New York Times, but certainly not representative of the more eclectic taste of critics or working musicians, and certainly not all the biggest crowd pleasers, although tends to lean a bit more in that direction. Now this is where I think we can look deeper, and how I was intrigued by professional singer-songwriter and educator Andrea Stolpe described her 3 principles of songwriting: prosody, momentum, and restraint. The first probably requires the most explanation. Prosody is a term from linguistics, specifically about the human voice that can shape specific moods or emotions delivered in said text. To quote her, the agreement between music and message. Music is the body language of our words. A lyric takes its meaning from the music that underscores it. And I would argue this concept can be extrapolated well beyond the written word. When you have more abstracted performances and production that rely upon texture or artistic paratext in order to convey meaning, that's got a lot of relevance. I would also say it is not a straightforward rule, because there's irony and sarcasm and deconstruction. We're adding in some tension between what you are saying in the lyrics and what the sound of the performance can be that will convey another layer, often very relevant. Her second principle is that of momentum, where Stolpe clarifies it's not so much tempo or meter, so much as the song delivering its beats at precisely the right pace. I'd also say that the lack of momentum in a specific piece, or where momentum is supposed to be and then denied, can also be a neat juxtaposition. Again, you've got that exception. Finally, restraint, where she describes the songs that should have their essential elements, and anything that you add up around these elements is complication or embellishment that might take away from that fundamental core that you are trying to express. And truthfully, I think restraint is an issue for both Noah Kahan and Bill Callahan, although it manifests in slightly different ways. Some of this is intertextual across the albums. Both these projects, they run long, they drag in their final third, and it's hard to avoid a slight feeling of indulgence in the stacked collections of songs with extended runtimes. Noah Kahan gets there through simply having a lot more songs, though more of them do run longer, including 4 more bonus tracks that are tacked on, but I often find this to be a niggling issue in his songwriting, his lyrics as well, where his control of meter and cadence are generally quite sound, but you'll get word choices that either feel a little too literal or perfunctory, or just awkwardly chosen in contrast for the intended tone or idea. Callahan's a little bit better in this territory. His writing is more diffuse and sparing. You can tell even when his word choices are more mundane, they feel a bit more purposeful. I mean, he can have a similar literalism in his songwriting. It's fascinating when that is framed as strength versus weakness by critics. Kind of revealing, but it's also where his lack of restraint can come. It's in the mantra-esque repetition of words, which causes compositions to drag and drag hard. At their best, he and his characters are ambling through a scene with a relaxed, meditative sprawl, even more accentuated this time with broader accents of tasteful, if slightly chaotic horns, woodwinds, keyboards, and weirder guitar textures, even some feminine backing vocals. I mean, if there's a tangible edge for Bill Callahan with a lot of critics, it's how much more diverse his eclectic, pensive, and slightly haunted arrangements are on this album. The project might not have as much driving momentum and more stark hooks, but it's got a sonic diversity that can craft one hell of a sense of atmosphere. It feels very distinctly its own. But at its worst, repetition starts feeling rote. An idea that either lyrical or melodic that you're meant to dwell upon, and it doesn't have enough meat to really stick. I mean, in either case, there's a good argument for grace. I'm open to them both, but they are both flaws. This is also where I want to accentuate that Stolpe highlights intuition as a fundamental element in her creative process, the push and pull between that and her intellect, and where you'll absolutely see a lot of folks highlighting that Bill Callahan's more freeform stylism, that's the decided advantage. It just feels more intuitive. Sure, Noah Kahan can craft one hell of a hook, but his formula is way more obvious. His choice of textures and delivery more beholden to modern conventions and a lot of his influences. And you can extrapolate and say the industry would necessarily put a damper on any intuition that doesn't result in a song that can sell and move units. Specifically, if you're familiar with Zach Bryan or Rustin Kelly, Mumford & Sons or The War on Drugs, or even a Hozier, Phoebe Bridgers, and Bon Iver in some of the soft moments, you might hear what Noah Kahan is doing and just be considerably less impressed because you've heard it before, especially when you get songs that can trace their lineage even further back to the heartland rock of decades ago, like American Cars or Deny, Deny, Deny. He might be working from what's been done before and done better. It's just more prominent in his sound. Does that feel all that intuitive if he's working from a template? But truthfully, I'm not sure it's fair to Noah Kahan, maybe giving Bill Callahan a little too much grace. After all, who's to say Noah Kahan's intuition doesn't lead him to that more accessible place? He has been very open about his inspirations, less respectable though they might be. It makes a lot of sense. It might be why it sounds so naturalistic coming out of him. To quote Noah Kahan's thoughts on the hardest part of songwriting, it's actually finding that emotional core to drive his work and then just starting to accentuate it. At many points coming forth from anger at his failure to not fully capture that emotion. And that might be relevant a little later. It also ignores that Bill Callahan is as much a product of his own long-entrenched formulas or other creative influences, and that's where his catalog is both strength and weakness. It might be great marketing for him to say that he is the medium to great fleeting ideas and inspiration, but you gotta build the frame around that, and Bill Callahan's frames are well worn. If you know his catalog, extremely familiar at this point. And this is where I might tread into some questionable territory when I say this. You might look at what Noah Kahan writes about and how he writes it as beholden to a lot of tropes in modern pop folk that fits on the playlist, dabbling in country and rock, whereas with Bill Callahan, you can track a similar tradition in subject matter and execution, but maybe not always to music, but to literature. Bill Callahan has highlighted that he is most focused on that lyrical structure in comparison with more melodic compositions, why the songs feel more free form, where it has prompted a lot of fans to compare him to novelists and great poets of our time, like Larry McMurtry or even Cormac McCarthy. Now, as a music critic, I have never really been a fan of this sort of cross-medium comparison because of what's left implied between the lines, that the writing of this music is so good that we can actually consider it on the same tier as proper literature, not a performance or just entertainment, which can feel kind of tacky in its reflexive dismissal of everything else presumably not worth considering and not particularly representative of specific works of fiction in times past and present have built their reputations, to say nothing of modern literature. But let's take it in good faith. Because on the one level, I do hear some of the parallels, distinctly windswept and spare, potentially difficult and brutal writing rooted in Americana, embracing solitude and touches of strange surrealism, quite dark and fatalistic, but with that underrated subtle sense of humor. I tend to be more of a Larry McMurtry fan, mostly because I got into his son James McMurtry's music and paradoxically worked backwards. Another songwriter who would deserve some of that conversation and acclaim, get on that New York Times. But it's also worth acknowledging that many of those books have been canonized in American literature and culture, and especially in the case of Cormac McCarthy, show up as male red flag reading list, especially if it's Blood Meridian. And I'm not going to tread on man-carrying thing in this analysis, he does it far more succinctly than I do, but I can hear some of the superficial parallels with Bill Callahan in stylism, if not substance. And the reality is they appeal to a specific demographic of slightly older dudes who want to appear more learned and literary. Would it be surprising to identify a lot of music critics or book critics or literature critics among that group who are just as receptive to praising what caters to their long-established taste? And I'm not even saying that playing up those themes and that resonance is wrong. It leads to great work. But critics can be just as vulnerable to having our own sensibilities flattered and our biases reinforced. And I don't always think we do the best job of reconciling that. LCD Sound System has entered the chat, but I don't even need to go that far. I'm a writer that loves self-conscious meta-commentary. Is it even a surprise that I framed this essay around these two men in this way, highlighting their songwriting and what specifically interests me, why I can call both their albums great? But even then, I spend a lot of time here describing interesting parallels, the mechanics of their writing that might prompt comparison, and I'm not going to make the big mistake of just focusing on methodology and craft when there's plenty of actual content and themes to analyze. Let's get to the juicy stuff. So here's a fun question. For those of you who have not listened to the Noah Kahan album, what do you think The Great Divide is about? In fact, let's throw the curveball to the other side of the strike zone. Noah Kahan fans who have not listened to Bill Callahan, what do you think his album is about? My hypothesis here is that more folks will be wrong about the preconceptions around what Noah Kahan is writing about than their thoughts on Bill Callahan. Mostly because of genre signifiers where stomp clap pop folk is considered more sensitive, romanticized, music for the girls, and if I hadn't made it plain in my underscores video essay, you can bet we're going to be coming back to that, in comparison with a willfully abstracted, spare singer-songwriter where I am shocked I have not made a Neil Young comparison, but man, it is really quite apt, and insert a lot of assumptions about that audience accordingly. Now, some of this might be because the older archetype of that grizzled singer-songwriter and their fans has a lot greater cultural prominence throughout media. It's immediately treated a little bit more seriously. But the reality of the works is Actually simpler. Bill Callahan is very settled into his work across music and writing. He is playing into type, whereas Noah Kahan might seem to do so in sound, but in the content, he's doing something very different. To put it bluntly, The Great Divide is Noah Kahan's angriest and messiest album to date. He was not kidding with that album title. It's the project about coming home into the sticks and feeling the sharp fissures between his newfound celebrity life and the place that he left behind. If I wanted to be more trite, he would call it his More Money, More Problems album, but truthfully, the emotions get into much messier territory than even this. Mostly a lot of guilt at getting out and not doing enough to help those who are back home, who are stuck subsisting however they can, building homes for the rich, and a lot of anger as he realizes those situations are not going to be easily rectified when a lot of very human emotion gets in the way, both his and that of others. And what I respect about Noah Kahan's framing is that it's wide enough to extend humanity to basically everyone. Try to give everyone their due when they have enough of a point in order to hit a raw nerve, which some critics have characterized as feeling redundant and hitting the same frustrated go-nowhere conflict over and over again, where eventually you run out of patience for either Noah Kahan's self-flagellation or the jilted people where he might be giving them too much credit or grace, be they friends or family or sputtering relationships like on Doors or Downfall. And that's not counting the wistful desire to get versions of friends or people back in his life where that's just not possible because of the circumstances they are caught within and how they've changed, like with Addiction on 23. This is where album length can both work for and against you. Even if the hooks keep the momentum up, this is a dynamic that will test your patience. And I get the feeling that's at least part of the point, where Noah Kahan has said he wished he could make this album even longer, when you have to go back home and it's just not as fun as you would hope, and time seems to stretch on into this agonizing, dissonant place as every attempt to bridge the divide between how they saw you before and who you are now keeps hitting these odd notes. Hell, that was an emotional beat that J. Cole, of all people, landed on the first half of The Fall Off. Arguably the best part of that project, especially where the place in which you used to live has shaped you enough to pull you back into a mental place that you thought you left behind. And for Noah Kahan, it's bringing a lot to the surface he hasn't processed. And yet, it's kind of odd. Seems like some critics don't want to confront the idea that Noah Kahan, of all people, can deliberately use uncomfortable emotions to provoke some introspection, that he can be taken seriously while doing so. It might be rooted in an awkward guilt that's misplaced on his part, the confusion that comes with privilege and success that feels too fast and a bit unearned, but in execution, there is a level-headed relatability and a mature depth that feels pretty effective, of which I don't think Noah Kahan's received due credit. Yeah, I'm going to give him all of that. Now, Bill Callahan's My Days at 58, in contrast, does not feel nearly as dark, at least not at first. I appreciate the irony that for as many comparisons as Callahan gets to the great Americana writers, his tone is a lot more bemused, wry, and lived in, where you get the impression of a solitary writer talking to himself in order to capture many flickering pictures, and where he actually has more love songs on this project than Noah Kahan does. Talk about a swerve, with fewer songs to boot. There's a layer of metatext in how he sees the work of a traveling musician and writer winding around wherever he might be going, but as he looks forward to the ghosts of the greats that are creeping ever closer, a darker, surreal space where he sees that impending darkness, there is a similar divide he feels between who he is and how he used his art around them, be it the audience or family back home. There's also a similar crux of masculine expectations that are weighing on his shoulders. His greatest fear is not dying, but where he will stop trying, where he needs to treat life seriously and then laugh in the face of death. Hell, Pathol OG has him trace through the artistic process over the years, where he identifies how his art was intended to help him communicate with others, but became this obsessive deflection in times of greater angst. his own Jacob's ladder leading up to heaven. And I just love how he highlights that maybe he should get the hell down and build a cross around himself for all his pretensions and whinging. The guilt feels kind of rooted in a similar place. He's just taking it more jovially. Callahan's also had the benefit of decades in order to process this. And yet I'm not even sure he fully has. Empathy is easily one of the best songs on the album because it considers family cycles of connection across generations, where he highlights some of his own struggles and failures to fully connect with his children these days the same way that his father did. He's having a bit more success, that's come with time, but a lot of old patterns, they die hard. Then there's Computer, which, let's not mince words, it's probably the song I like the least from both albums, where Callahan highlights how the technology drives people away from their humanity, where he's more willing to hear free speech from everyone just so he can figure it all out, capping off the song highlighting how he doesn't want to hear auto-tune because it is prepping us to be satisfied being sung by someone without a spirit. Someone told the Postal Service that. And as much as I want to be generous and highlighting how, of course, the grizzled folk Gen X singer-songwriter is going to have this opinion, he's shown flashes of this across the past 15 years. It also shows the weakness of this sort of myopic introspection. It doesn't consider systems or the agitators that would use them. And I respect Callahan too much as a writer to just call it his own naivete. He knows a little better. He could have done better. It's also at least the album ending with a rather downbeat closer in The World Is Still, with lines like, and nothing ever changes, and nothing ever will. I mean, you can call it the cynicism of middle age when you've seen a bit too much and think you all know how it all must end, but juxtaposed against the more winsome and warm moments, it is a jarring, if expected ending, highlighting how much he really believes in laughing in the face of death. I gotta be honest, I don't love that either. So there is this fascinating contrast that is on display here, because while the anxieties of Noah Kahan and Bill Callahan are different, because duh, of course they are, they're at very different stages of their life and careers, there is a common root in feeling like there's this lack of deeper connection. Noah Kahan is more invested in the man versus man conflict that's provoking it. He can see systems, he feels a paralyzing frustration at his culpability, the fissures that he's got to live with in his relationships, the struggles to connect with others feel far more acutely charged because he didn't have the luxury to venture out into the wilderness. The penultimate Bon Iver-esque song, All Them Horses, with some really gorgeous fiddle, it is racked with that sort of guilt for not doing enough to help during the Vermont floods, a community obligation with celebrity that shows how he really can't be as separate from the world as he might want to be in his most selfish moments. Whereas for Bill Callahan, it is more man versus self, interrogating his own behaviors that might have perpetuated it, where he is increasingly pensive and diaristic in how he will look at himself, detached from the world. It's actually prompted some critics to second-guess their positive thoughts on My Days at 58. To quote Mark Richardson at Pitchfork in his review, the risk of artless oversharing is even higher, where in comparison with the abstract surrealism that this might feel more base, a little less interesting. And not only do I think the framing of that's kind of off, for at least the past 15 years, Bill Callahan has become a more personal and revealing writer in his own unique way, especially in the arc of an album like Dream River, or especially Shepherd in a Sheepskin Vest, but the conflicts described, they can produce more immediately compelling stories than this solitary musing that's trying to be more abstract. You would think as Bill Callahan got older, he would get even weirder, more offbeat, more abstract, play into the idealized legend writer archetype that crafts the strange and surreal from on high, but instead, he's dipped a lot closer to humanity. And where the most pathos has come has been in the interactions with people that he's struggling to fully understand after years, if not decades, for better or for worse. Where on West Texas, he quotes Francis Bacon with, "Whosoever is delighted with solitude is either a wild beast or a god." That sound familiar? In both cases, you're dealing with men experiencing some self-afflicted alienation through the artifice that they themselves have created and the struggle they have to bridge that great divide. But their time frames and trajectories are just in different stories. Bill Callahan came up in an era of artistry where you could be fundamentally offline, build a smaller following, but one with its own acclaim, and you can have a career, whereas Noah Kahan's arc has been much more compressed, forcing an immediacy with more scrutiny because it's far more difficult and precarious to break as a working artist today, even if you've got an accessible sound and a built-in audience, as he presumably has, as he can lock onto the streaming playlist. In both cases, there's this existential tension where neither have a clear answer, and both journeys are needed to reach something close to truth. And yet, I circle back to that feeling of incredulity when I thought of comparing these two with any measure of sincerity. I mean, a part of me expected this script would wind up kind of a riff or shorter outing, but the deeper I dug into the details, the more I realized not only was there emotional common ground in text and subtext, but the most would never bother to look or even consider it. Not because the comparison was not credible from both sides, but folks wouldn't want it to be. That perhaps there is more in common than we would realize and we don't want, especially if you haven't taken the time to actually hear both projects. In fact, you know what? If you think you know so well, let's play a game. I'm going to describe a song with just enough detail, and you can guess who wrote it. I mean, surely y'all have been paying close enough attention to figure out whose is whose, and you've heard both albums. You're confident that you could speak on them both, right? Especially if we're talking about song topics so broadly. If I wanted to be harsh, I'd provide snippets of poetry from both the projects and then make you guess, but you know, we'll keep it light. We'll make it easy. You know what, let's start easy. Who wrote a song with multiple allusions to legends and music in questioning one's role as an artist? I mean, I talked about this earlier. That's Bill Callahan with Why Do Men Sing? It is the opening track. It's awesome. Who wrote a song about arguing with a friend about politics and then failing to connect with them? Again, that's kind of easy. I talked about this before. That's Noah Kahan with actually multiple songs in this territory, which some have called redundant, but I would argue work both within the songs. There are different shades of emotion and in sequence with each other, where the arguments that seem endless eventually curdle and they get harsher with time. From Haircut calling out some of that moral presumptuousness that is cutting both ways, to Willing and Able capturing that late night breather to just stare daggers at each other and hope you might come together, to Dashboard, where you realize it's just not going to work out at all, and really you wanted it to, because all that self-improvement might just feel like window dressing if it turns out you're all assholes. Arguably, I think this is the emotional centerpiece of the album. For better or for worse, I find it incredibly effective. But okay, who wrote the sandy shuffling song referencing a dream of love alongside murder and aliens? Okay, Bill Callahan, duh. But how about a song reflecting on encroaching death, where haunted and distorted patterns of life and death and getting older does not pull away from a lot of familiar cycles? Okay, yeah, Bill Callahan touches on this, but what I'm thinking about here is Noah Kahan and the pretty good opener, End of August. How about the atmospheric musings on writing that pulls away from home, with the fear that he's always deflecting away from his true self, yet can't quite escape it? Yeah, you might think this is also a Bill Callahan song. It's got signifiers, but I'd probably point to We Go Way Back by Noah Kahan, even if I think some of the actual rhymes in that song are a little bit clumsy. What about a more atmospheric cycling track about rediscovering your confidence in your community, seeing your world open up in ways that you could never possibly expect? A desperately bright note amidst the turmoil, even as you untangle what it means to your ego long term. Well, this might surprise you, or maybe not, to learn that neither of the men wrote this song. It's called Vanity Paradox, from the self-titled album from Wendy Eisenberg. I really wanted a reason to reference her in this video. She's conspicuously not been reviewed at length on this entire platform, but she's been getting a lot of buzz from the whole Pitchfork set as an improvisational multi-instrumentalist who finally pivoted into making a more structured, song-focused project with a freewheeling compositional style that reminds me of what I've long wished Big Thief would actually be for me, and who should be very appealing to those who like someone like Bill Callahan. Along with a very candid sweetness in her vocal delivery, that would make her an easy sell for a lot of Noah Kahan's audience, right? I mean, surely you're about to seek her out now, right? But okay, fine. Off track there. How about songs about complicated relationships with parental figures, specifically reflecting on inabilities to fully communicate the breadth of their emotions? Now, here's the funny thing. You could argue that both of them have these. Noah Kahan having that single Porch Light and the messy deep cut Spoiled, and Bill Callahan having Empathy, and the moment where parents are actually buried on Lake Winnebago that has all sorts of subtext. Ironic, the former has probably one of the weakest songs on his album, and the latter's got one of his best. And in all cases, they touch on how making money within the music, it's considered a signifier of respect by parents, even if it's an added complexifier for the children to come. But okay, what about the soft-focused commemoration of one's home that's drenched in classical Americana that could also slot into a very dudes rock context? I mean, you could argue that both of them have this too. West Texas on one side and the closer Dan on the other. Both pretty damn great songs. Actually, how about a challenging tearjerker written about an elderly relative who is struggling with dementia or Alzheimer's? A lot of the struggles of memory as you get older. That feels very relevant. That's She Plays the Piano, by Tenille Townes, who put out the pretty damn good all-acoustic album The Acrobat earlier this April on an independent label after getting dropped by Sony, and it could really use a lot more attention. I figured I'd mention her too, especially as the writing cuts just as deeply, and she features Lori McKenna on a fantastic title track. You know, Lori McKenna, the behind-the-scenes, Grammy-winning veteran singer-songwriter who actually has the classic albums on her own to deserve making that New York Times list, even over someone like Jason Isbell. Yeah, I said it. Come to think of it, another singer-songwriter who might deserve some of that shine and who also conspicuously has a song in that same territory, Emily Scott Robinson with her album Appalachia, who is still the prime contender for the best album of 2026 and who does not have a dud in her catalog, with a few of the best projects of the past 10 years. How many more rooftops am I gonna have to scream about this before the critical or commercial establishment bothers to highlight her as a better writer and a better performer than the vast majority of the field right now? I mean, surely you're all bothering to take them seriously next to the two guys here, right? Accessible acts, speak to the feminine experience, gorgeous harmonies, thought-provoking, and really challenging lyricism. Surely they are worth that same amount of critical observation, a shot at the same sort of commercial push. Of course, I know half of why this is. That being the commercial angle, which is why a whole swath of songwriters that I would put on a higher tier or like a lot more just don't get considered. They're a little too idiosyncratic, they're a little too raw for the very obvious commercial crossover to fit neatly on one of those playlists. They're the bridesmaids but never the brides, who don't appear to have the right look or the right age or the ambition or backing to become those superstars, even if they've got the talent to make it, especially as it feels like we're further past the era where a label will painstakingly develop an artist, and even when they do in the modern age, these types, they rarely stay in line. Most don't have the decades of history for a free pass in the press package that is sent in advance. So their songs might get handed off to other artists, behind the scenes, or they might get a feature credit. I'll give Noah Kahan a lot of props for being a great sport and putting on a lot of the acts that he loves, even if he knows he's gonna get outshone while doing it. No. The part I find more infuriating, yeah, it's my field. The other critics who always seem to find the convenient excuses to look the other way, even if some of those acts might be up their alley in sound or politics. I appreciate that friend and colleague Hannah Jocelyn asked the question of why a few of those acts didn't quite break through or catch the same attention that Noah Kahan did in her Pitchfork review of The Great Divide. And that's a really good question that I can sadly answer rather easily because I searched that site's archive. They weren't reviewed. Laurie McKenna has been active since the 2000s, over 25 years. She was reviewed once, 2016, for The Bird and the Rifle. Emily Scott Robinson released Appalachia in the traffic dead zone of January this year, where Pitchfork could have used the article and you could not find one writer to cover it, even when Bandcamp's algorithm serving it up. But I've got more of an issue for the critics who claim that higher, more learned artistic ideal, especially some of the older ones near Gen X who claim to be more exploratory, who wind up ignoring the acts who write just enough hooks with just enough of an accessible tone or subject matter. That is, until they make their only exceptions. And yes, I absolutely hold all the fan-driven aggregator sites as embarrassingly complicit in this, especially when you want an easy excuse to slag who you think might be in their fan base. Usually a lot of young women who are probably better read than you are, and then reveal your own tired superiority complexes. This is what I find so gallingly transparent about this, because for as much as tastes are more refined or more literate, the selections often prove to be just as safe and depressingly obvious, either an easy default to the known commodities, or where at the end of any given year for that one country album that gets considered, if they were reviewed at all, in the rare press package that breaks containment, I have to read the umpteenth attempt to make a sanitized Brooklyn indie alternative band reskinning what indie country already did years earlier, and then have the temerity for them to claim they're the standard bearers of what country is. I'd say you're supposed to be better, but I've seen what you've written. Or rather, what you revealingly haven't. I apologize. Bit of a tangent. We were supposed to be talking about Noah Kahan and Bill Callahan. Let's pick up the pace here. And you know what? Let's make the tougher and consider the wealth of driving songs across both of these albums, because both men prominently feature the road and driving, albeit in different contexts. So who wrote that road song where the artist is watching a friend self-destruct on said road with the desperate hope that he can pull it all together, maybe recapture his own struggles with faith? Who wrote the road song characterizing themselves as a drifter in between towns where he struggles to slow down? Who wrote the road song idealizing escape amidst familial obligations, even despite having that someone who will always seem to make it back and accommodate his dreams that seem to collapse a bit on contact with reality? Who wrote the song about a car crash where you were helping get a questionable friend robbing a store and then you're trying to recover even as she took off? That last one. The song in question, it's called Learning to Drive Again. It's a true rager. Absolutely kicks ass. You might have missed it. Because do y'all remember Adeem The Artist? I mean, they put out some of the best singer-songwriter albums of the early 2020s, and they've been going through a really rough patch the past year or so. So they made a quick Bandcamp exclusive album on the cheap called Notes From Inside in order to actually afford some good mental health care. It's absolutely raw. It's rough. I wouldn't exactly call it commercial around the edges and composition, but it's intensely immediate. It's revealing. It's got plenty of Adeem's vicious cutting lines, their sense of humor, their heart as they literally try to write their way out with framing that does not spare themselves, and a lot of painstaking honesty. It's very telling that when we get bound up in larger conversations about great songwriters and the mingled complications of guilt, we tend to ignore those who are disenfranchised on the fringes, who have just as much talent, go through many of the same issues, but also don't have that same safety net, and who audiences and critics are quick to dispose of when it becomes a little too uncomfortable or inconvenient. Are they afforded the same community, the same grace, let alone acclaim? Or are they simply left to be mislabeled as a B-side for a more accessible singer-songwriter, when even that writer is then left off the list of the greatest American living songwriters? How much of our affection for an artist is built out of convenience? What empathy that we have chosen that they are afforded, that only seems to go down when the clown wipes off their makeup, The acrobat puts away her tights, and the dirtbag saloon closes up for the night before they are then priced out of town. What sort of twisted American Calvinism affords empathy and material support for those that have the most rather than the least? Where it's considered bad taste to bring any of this up. The material reality of artists as a critic because you want to live in the fantasy, a liberal unreality that it's a level playing field, only to keep reinforcing the paradigm. Where I knew in my gut that setting all of this up as this insane competition would get more eyes and ears, some of the people I just mentioned, because it must be a zero-sum game to them, a hierarchy, a tier list, with the hopes that maybe enough people might get behind working artists who actually need some of that real support. I mean, I got a lot of privilege, but I have never had the privilege of the construction of the mask of good taste. Fuck that, my bad taste is better anyway.
I'm gonna leave you anyway. I'm gonna leave you anyway. I'm gonna leave you anyway.
So there's this scene in the fantastic TV romantic comedy drama You're the Worst, in which the couple of Jimmy and Gretchen, played by Chris Gere and Aya Cash, who are just the goddamn worst people in the show, that's a compliment, during a day drinking Sunday fun day and a trip to a record store.
Hey, pick a record. My treat.
All right, big spender. This one.
Aha, Genesis. Good. Okay, but not until you tell me if you are a Peter Gabriel or a Phil Collins.
They're both good.
The show uses pop culture remarkably well. It really deserves that 2-hour video essay that I don't have quite the time to make. But this moment really stuck out to me as what is being said and what is being commented upon.
What's the big deal?
The big deal is that you cannot like two things which are diametrically opposed.
Huh. And yet I do.
Jimmy is very obviously a Peter Gabriel fan for the dark, moody prog side of things, what is considered artistically dense and intense by critics in comparison with Genesis in their sellout years, alongside a bunch of other masculine signifiers he tries to bring up, like Sean Connery over Roger Moore as the James Bond, or eggs over pancakes. But Gretchen doesn't give him the satisfaction of choosing between that binary.
You know why I don't want to pick Peter Gabriel or Phil Collins? Because you are just waiting for me to pick wrong so you can judge me, and why would I want to put myself through that?
Because I'm asking you to.
Even though Jimmy is very obviously using it as an extended metaphor between him and the other dude that Gretchen is kind of banging on the side. That is the text. That's the initial subtext. But the cultural observation is that there is a specific subset of dudes where the masculine signifiers are increasingly haphazard in their construction to signal to the world who they want to be, even if it's not really representative of what's actually in the art if they're given any deeper consideration. Larry McMurtry has gone on record how his darkly brutal exploration of the Wild West and the Lonesome Dove was not intended to be interpreted as an idealization of that era, which is how popular culture would recontextualize that material in the mid-'80s. The folk who get enamored with the dark stylism and the violence and what they want it to say rather than what it may have actually said. You get that in Reagan's America. Gretchen's arc was actually learning to commit to a choice of what and who she actually wants. Jimmy's is to recognize that for all the pretension and construction of singular narrative around himself.
Listen, Phil Collins, he has his merits, right? As lightweight and nutritional as they are, I mean, really, land of confusion, this leaden pleas for world peace and the healing power of love. Thank you, George Bernard Shaw. Give me a fortnight to machete my way through the dense, metaphoric thicket of those lyrics.
Jimmy.
And while Peter Gabriel, he's complex, dark, you know, interesting. I recognise that it can be nice to have some breezy, no reply at all fun.
It has to make contact with a more mundane and complicated reality where narrative collapses. He's not the only main character.
No, but following you around all day today, just trying to convince you what to do, well, it's just made me feel, it's made me feel ashamed, and jealous, and low, like Phil Collins when he wrote Susudio.
Jimmy.
But if one day, right, eggs forced you to choose between themselves and pancakes, and you chose the soggy, tasteless pancakes and never ate eggs ever again, I'm just saying eggs would be really sad.
And then coming up with a string of half-coherent masculine metaphors after starting off your day drinking with a triple whiskey neat might not lead to the best of conclusions. A lesson I think we all could learn.
So just to be clear, on one side, it's eggs, Peter Gabriel, and you, and on the other side, it's pancakes, Phil Collins, and Ty?
You know, I've been drinking all day. Honestly, I'm not even sure anymore.
In case you haven't figured it out, this wasn't much of a showdown between folk singer-songwriters. I'm not sure I changed anybody's mind. And truthfully, I never intended that. And it was never intended to be that. The implied dare of the comparison was and still is a little compelling, don't get me wrong. But the more I dug into the weeds, the more I realized that not only were both albums great, probably a little misunderstood for their trouble by their own audiences, but they had more in common and complementary resonance as someone who is older than Noah Kahan, younger than Bill Callahan, and appreciates more of both. Was Bill Callahan a more familiar appreciation? Yeah, sure. I've been told I'm old before my time in my early 20s, where nobody ever quite stops to consider what shapes you to be so. But the fact that Noah Kahan has a higher mountain to climb left me just as impressed, but in a different way. What I also found fascinating was how much of this sort of comparison is a blinkered experience. Criteria defined by exceptions and excuses, and that so many are not inclined to seriously examine their biases, positive or negative, because be it art or entertainment, that becomes totems for a repeatable emotional resonance, where we can call forth to be emblematic of what makes us feel, what makes us think, what makes us love, and draw forth lines between those who feel different rather than bridge the great divide, ford the dream river, and maybe find more than we bargained for along the way. But I don't know. I don't think this is a zero-sum game, y'all. The city does not have to be this lonely. And you do not have to get down off the ladder just to pick up a cross. The car does not have to remain running in a closed garage. I don't know. Maybe we all just have to learn to drive again.